A few weeks ago, I was grabbing coffee with a macro trader who specializes in emerging markets.
Oh, I know the type.
Yeah, exactly. And he was just vibrating with this nervous energy, pointing at the latest 2026 growth projections for China, that, 4.8% to 5.1% range.
And let me guess, he thought that was bad news.
He called it a bland facade. His whole thing was, if the number isn't swinging wildly, it's not real growth. He saw it as a state-managed sedative. He was absolutely convinced the engine was stalling underneath that steady line.
It's a common view in that world. They're conditioned to see volatility as a sign of life. Stability makes them nervous.
Exactly. But then he showed me something that really bothered him. It wasn't a debt to GDP chart or a consumer confidence survey. It was a series of logistics heat maps.
Physical data.
Physical data, energy consumption data from these massive industrial clusters in Zhejiang. And while the Western financial world is, convulsing over interest rate pivots and market entropy, these physical hubs were just operating with this eerie rhythmic precision.
Like a machine.
Like a machine. He pointed at the screen and said, look at the overhead. Global energy prices are a total roller coaster. Europe is terrified of winter heating bills, but the power costs for these factories.
Flat.
Completely flat. He said, it's like they've opted out of the global chaos, and that's when the whole contradiction just clicked for me.
I think that story gets to the very heart of what we're going to talk about today. We've become so focused on the abstract metrics, the GDP targets, the debt cycles, all of it, that we are missing this massive structural shift happening in the physical economy.
It's like we're watching the stock ticker while they're building the factory. What he saw as a bland GDP figure is actually the signature of a civilization that stopped playing the game of financial sentiment and started obsessing over the physics of the real world.
Right. And that raises a really profound question for the global order. What happens when one major economy decides to stop chasing sentiment and starts building an unbreakable fortress of physical certainty?
So that's our deep dive today. We're going to unpack this huge divergence. On one side, a system that thrives on and is maybe even trapped by financial volatility. On the other, a system building this fortress based on industrial self-sufficiency.
And we're going to analyze it through three core pillars. First, we have to look at the state capacity to stabilize energy costs. That's the bedrock. Second, we'll examine how their economy is being fundamentally restructured away from speculation and toward physical industrial dominance.
And the third?
And third, we have to dissect the institutional models themselves. A technocratic system built for rapid execution versus what we'll see is a system of institutional gridlock. This isn't a competition in finance anymore. It's a competition in the ability to build things.
Okay, so let's start with the hard evidence. The physical facts that show this industrial fortress isn't just a metaphor. The numbers coming out of China's clean energy sectors are, well, they're not just big. They suggest a total replatforming of the economy.
The single most compelling figure, the one that should force a complete reset for any macro analyst, is from 2024. Clean energy technologies contributed a record 10% of China's total GDP.
10%? That's not a rounding error. That's a core economic pillar.
It's not a subsidized sideline or some pilot program. This is now the central, indispensable engine of their economic expansion.
Let's put that in perspective for everyone listening. That 10% value, covering sales and investments, totaled 13.6 trillion yuan. That's roughly 1.9 trillion US dollars.
I mean, that's a figure comparable to the entire GDP of a country like Australia or Mexico.
Yeah.
An entire economy the size of Australia built just on manufacturing and deploying new energy tech.
And here's the really critical context, right? The political shift this represents. That 10% figure is now a larger share of the economy than two pillars that drove their growth for decades.
Exactly. Clean energy's 13.6 trillion yuan contribution is bigger than real estate sales, which was 9.6 trillion. It's bigger than agriculture at 9.1 trillion yuan.
So the state's focus, the source of stability, has fundamentally shifted away from land speculation and traditional industry towards advanced manufacturing and energy infrastructure.
It's a tectonic shift. It redefines which interest groups hold power. And it explains exactly what your trader friend saw. The engine isn't stalling, it's being completely retooled.
And the speed of that retooling is just breathtaking. These sectors grew 3 times faster than the overall Chinese economy in 2024.
And that growth wasn't just fast, it was strategically vital. The data shows this clean tech sector drove an astonishing 26% of all GDP growth last year.
26%.
So here's the systemic finding for any analyst trying to understand their resilience. Without that contribution, China would have missed its 5% GDP target by a mile. they would have only hit 3.6%.
So the bland facade of stable growth is actually the direct result of targeted, massive, physical industrial execution. The stability is earned, not just managed.
That's it, exactly.
Okay, so let's break down the components of this new engine. They talk about the new three. What are they, and how do they drive this industrial core?
The new three are solar, electric vehicles, EVs, and batteries. And this isn't an arbitrary grouping. It reflects a very strategic concentration of capital and resources.
A focused bet.
A huge one. These three industries generated 3/4 of the total value added in the entire clean energy sector. And they attracted over half of all the investment that went into these strategic areas.
So they're not trying to do everything at once. They're aiming for total dominance in a few key areas.
And within that trio, EVs and batteries are the heavyweights. They accounted for about 39% of the total value. And the sheer output is almost hard to comprehend. In 2024, they produced 13 million new energy vehicles.
13 million. That's a 34% rise from the year before.
And that pace of scaling is really what defines this strategic divergence. Think about this. Back in 2013, their total EV production was only about 20% of the U.S. total.
Right.
Today, just over a decade later, it is 200% of the U.S. total.
Wow. From a fifth to double in a decade.
That's not organic market growth. That is a deliberate, state-backed campaign to dominate an entire global industry. And it's not just for export. NEVs now make up 41% of their total domestic vehicle sales.
That's a huge jump from 32% the year before. So this manufacturing capacity is being absorbed at home, which is key for reducing their reliance on oil.
Exactly. That rapid domestic adoption is critical. Now, it's worth noting a nuance here. Some critics point out that a lot of this growth is in plug-in hybrids, which aren't fully green.
Right. They only deliver the environmental benefit if you actually plug them in and drive them mostly on electricity.
True. But the usage data we have is actually pretty compelling. The electricity consumption for EV battery charging and swapping services rose by 51% in 2024.
51%? That's a huge number.
It's a very high usage level, and it suggests that the infrastructure, the easy access to charging, the battery swapping stations, it's all working to maximize the electric miles driven. They seem to be mitigating that hybrid gap you see in other markets.
Okay, so let's move to solar, the second of the new three. The capacity surge here feels like the clearest signal of this shift towards building physical certainty, towards generating actual electrons.
It really is. They added a staggering 277 gigawatts of new solar capacity in 2024. That's a 28% increase on what was already a global record-breaking year for them.
And this has actually changed where the investment money is going, right? It's not just about building factories anymore.
Correct. Investment in power generation projects, that's the solar farms and installations themselves, hit 1 trillion yuan. That actually surpassed the investment in manufacturing, which was 0.8 trillion.
So the strategic focus has shifted from making the panels to generating the power.
It's a move from potential capacity to actual reliable electrons on the grid. That's the physical truth we're talking about.
And where is all this colossal new capacity being built?
It's a two-pronged strategy. A huge chunk is going into these massive clean energy bases in the western provinces, like Xinjiang and Inner Mongolia, where you have vast open land and incredible sun.
Makes sense.
But at the same time, you're seeing massive distributed capacity being built in the coastal manufacturing hubs. Jiangsu, Zhejiang, Guangdong, these are the industrial zones.
And they're building it right there to power the factories.
Exactly. They're optimizing for local consumption, driven by rising commercial electricity prices and local pressure to hit energy-saving targets. This is how you insulate your industrial core from global energy volatility.
And that ties directly back to my friend's observation about the flat power costs. The factory is insulated because it's sourcing power from its own roof or a nearby solar farm. But that only works if the grid can actually handle it.
And that leads us to the real linchpin of the strategy, the race in storage and transmission. This is maybe the most crucial insight into how they're achieving genuine energy independence.
Okay, so storage and transmission. This is where it gets really interesting because for the first time on record in 2024, the growth in their electricity storage capacity actually rivaled the increase in fossil fuel generation.
That is a landmark moment. It's a fundamental shift in how you plan for grid resilience.
What are the numbers that back that up?
The figures are nearly perfectly balanced. They added approximately 50 gigawatts of storage capacity. That's utility-scale batteries, pumped hydro, even some early hydrogen production.
50 gigawatts. And fossil fuels.
They added 54 gigawatts of new fossil fuel capacity in the same period.
So they're almost one for one. Why is that so significant?
Because Traditionally, the whole reason you build expensive, high-emission coal and gas plants is for capacity adequacy. They're the reliable backup for when the sun isn't shining or the wind isn't blowing.
Right, the base load.
Exactly. So when scalable storage capacity starts to actively supplant the need for that fossil fuel backup, you are taking a monumental physical step toward a truly independent and stable grid.
Storage is effectively replacing the need to burn more coal just to keep the lights on. And we saw that battery storage itself grew 70% year on year, right? Reaching 74 gigawatts of total capacity.
And the pipeline for future projects is just massive. For pumped hydro, where you use excess energy to pump water uphill and release it to generate power when you need it, they have 189 gigawatts currently under construction.
So this is only going to accelerate. But storage is only half the battle. You have to physically move the power from those sunny western deserts to the factories in the east.
Which brings us to those long-distance, ultra-high voltage, or UHV, transmission lines.
I know the scale of this network is huge, but what's the technical significance of UHV? Why is it so important?
The physics of UHV are essential to understanding the fortress. UHV usually means direct current, or DC, transmission above 800 kilovolts. And that's critical because you're moving power over immense distances, sometimes 3,000 kilometers or more.
And normal AC power lines lose too much energy over that distance.
A prohibitive amount. UHV DC technology minimizes that line loss, often down to just 3 or 4% per 1,000 kilometers. This is the physical mechanism that makes the vast solar and wind potential of the West economically viable for the coastal factories.
It's the technology that unlocks the geography. How big is this network now?
They have 42 operational UHV lines covering over 40,000 kilometers with a capacity of over 300 gigawatts, and there are 12 more under construction.
It's a national circulatory system for electrons.
It is. And the top economic planner has released a new action plan. The goal is to integrate over 200 gigawatts of new wind and solar per year between 2025 and 2027. That mandates massive ongoing investment in both storage and transmission. It's a complete long-term commitment.
The ambition and the execution are just extraordinary. But let's tackle a major critique that you always hear. That manufacturing all this green tech, the polysilicon, the aluminum, the steel is incredibly energy intensive. Doesn't this just shift the carbon problem from one place to another?
That is a critical, precise question. And it's one where you have to look past the assumptions and get into the specific data. A lot of commentators assume that this industrial build-out must be a major driver of their current emissions.
And the data says otherwise.
The data says otherwise. The analysis shows that the role of the new three in driving emissions growth is, well, surprisingly small.
Okay, what's the bottom line on emissions?
The data indicates that those new three industries, EVs, batteries, and solar, were responsible for only about 3.5% of China's total CO2 emissions in 2024. And they contributed just 0.9 percentage points to the overall emissions growth.
So the massive record-breaking industrial build-out of green tech is not the primary driver of new carbon emissions.
It is not. Nor is it the primary driver of electricity demand growth, accounting for only a fraction of that. The emissions growth is coming from other, more traditional and less efficient industrial sectors.
And that's a critical distinction to make.
It's a vital one. It means the strategic industrial policy is being executed. And while there is a carbon cost to manufacture this stuff, that cost is relatively contained. The industrial base is being built now, establishing global dominance. The massive CO2 savings will come later from the mass deployment of these technologies replacing coal plants and gasoline cars.
So they're paying a relatively small carbon price now for a massive long-term benefit in both emissions and energy cost stabilization.
That's the strategic trade-off. They're establishing physical dominance first.
This successful execution of long-term physical control brings us right to this strategic divergence in global power models. We have China betting its future on technological supremacy and electrification.
And on the other side, you have the United States leveraging its existing resource-based oil and gas for immediate geopolitical and financial gain.
And this contest, the split between stabilizing energy prices versus contributing to global inflationary volatility, it really becomes the definitive benchmark for state capacity today.
It is absolutely the contest of the 20th century model versus the 21st century model of energy security. The U.S. model is all about monetizing its existing geological wealth. We saw this in October 2025 when U.S. crude production hit a record 13.87 million barrels per day.
That's an incredible amount of oil. It provides immediate energy independence and, of course, huge geopolitical leverage.
It's a massive strategic asset, no question. But the power it provides is based on leveraging what's already in the ground and managing market volatility, not creating a new physical system from scratch.
Right, which is the contrast. The Chinese model is this state-driven transition to technological supremacy. They hit their 2030 wind and solar goals 6 years early.
It's a totally different philosophy. It's not about selling a resource. It's about controlling the entire manufacturing value chain and exporting that industrial policy globally. They dominate over 80% of global solar manufacturing and are the leader in wind turbines.
The pace of execution is really the critical differentiator, isn't it? It shows the structural capability to turn a policy goal into physical reality years ahead of schedule.
Exactly. But let's look at how these two models clash in the global market, especially when it comes to instability.
So the U.S. supply surge is the main thing putting downward pressure on global oil prices. The forecasts are for domestic crude to average 13.5 million barrels a day through 2025 and 2026.
Right. That high output is driving a bearish outlook. The world is basically absorbing a flood of cheap American oil.
But the volatility, the wild price swings, they persist. And that's amplified by geopolitical tension. Things like the $11 billion arms sale to Taiwan or instability in the Middle East, they inject this constant risk premium into the market.
That is the essential instability factor. The market's response to geopolitical friction is often asymmetrical. The risk of a sudden supply shock, say, a conflict disrupting shipping lanes in the Taiwan Strait, is seen as far greater than any upside from a drop in demand.
So even with record supply from the U.S., that geopolitical risk keeps prices volatile and keeps a premium baked in.
It does, and that volatility is exactly what those industrial centers in Zhejiang are opting out of by controlling their own domestic power costs.
But here's the conundrum, right? Despite its massive renewable push, China is still the world's biggest oil importer. They're bringing in something like 11.45 million barrels a day.
Yeah.
Isn't that a massive vulnerability that undercuts the whole fortress idea?
That's a fundamentally important question. And the answer lies in what you could call a dual stability strategy. Yes, that continued massive demand for oil is a vulnerability, but it's also a calculated counterweight.
A counterweight to what?
To a price collapse. That massive appetite for crude absorbs the global glut. It prevents a severe, destabilizing price crash that could be triggered by the U.S. supply surge. What you have is this underlying structural balance. Record production met by resilient record consumption.
So it's a strategy for stability through demand. They secure the external supply they need for now, while the shift to renewables stabilizes their domestic costs for the long term.
It creates dual stability. The U.S. relies on market fluctuation and short-term leverage from its oil. China stabilizes its industrial inputs by controlling domestic generation costs and securing the external commodity flows it needs.
And this strategy extends beyond their borders through the Belt and Road Initiative, which is essentially a global electrification campaign.
It is. The dual-purpose campaign is critical. It starts with securing hydrocarbon supplies for short-term stability. They invest heavily in energy infrastructure in Africa and the Middle East to ensure stable oil and gas flows, insulating them from Western financial or political pressure.
But the real 21st century statecraft is exporting their renewable tech dominance. We talked about their 80% share of solar panel production. How does that manufacturing scale translate into geopolitical power?
It creates a self-reinforcing system. By building and financing massive solar and wind projects from Latin America to Southeast Asia, they are embedding their technology and their standards into the core energy systems of partner nations.
So they're creating a physical network that locks in a kind of technological dependency on their equipment, their standards, their replacement parts.
That's exactly it. They're exporting industrial policy, not just products. They're embedding their physical truth into the global economy.
Which builds a tangible geopolitical counterweight to Western-led financial institutions.
It does. It creates a world where energy infrastructure isn't just a utility, it's a critical node in a new power structure. They're establishing control over both traditional fuel access and the technology of the future.
Okay, we've laid out the industrial engine and these diverging energy models. Now let's throw a massive new variable into the mix. The explosive demand from artificial intelligence. This is really going to test the resilience of both strategies.
AI is the ultimate demand catalyst. It's creating what we can call a critical electron gap. Data centers require staggering amounts of constant, reliable power. The winner of the AI race will ultimately be the one who can deliver those electrons sustainably and affordably.
And this demand spike immediately throws the strategic differences between the two models into sharp relief.
It absolutely does.
So in the US, the solution to this electron gap seems to be prioritizing speed and reliability, drawing on the massive energy base that already exists.
Correct. The U.S. strategy is leveraging its record fossil fuel output and accelerating nuclear development. We've seen executive orders aimed at speeding up licenses for all forms of high-output, reliable power oil, gas, nuclear.
It's a short-term, high-output approach designed to power the next generation of data centers as quickly as possible.
Precisely. And the rival strategy. It's a bet on massive, scalable, renewable capacity and long-term control.
They're betting on sustainability and control over the whole supply chain.
Exactly. We mentioned earlier that 86% of their new power capacity in 2024 was renewable. That gives them a potential scalable advantage in supplying the vast long-term electricity needs of AI clusters. Their existing manufacturing base for solar allows for incredibly rapid and cheap deployment.
So the competition shifts from just who invents the next great algorithm to who can physically power the data center sustainably and cheaply at scale.
Which brings us directly to the major vulnerability for the U.S. model, the supply chain fortress that secures the inputs for all this renewable capacity.
This is the definitive factor, the control of the atomic inputs.
To dominate clean energy manufacturing, you have to secure near monopolies across multiple key links in the supply chain. The raw materials. If you control the atoms, you control the manufacturing.
So let's just inventory the depth of this fortress. The control over raw material refining is a physical choke point for the entire global high-tech transition.
It is comprehensive and deeply strategic. They control 60% of the global supply of polysilicon, which is essential for solar panels. For rare earth metals, used in everything from wind turbines to advanced electronics, they control 70% of supply and 90% of the refining capacity.
90% of refining. That's the real chokehold, isn't it?
It's the ultimate physical constraint. Refining rare earths is a complex, environmentally heavy process that most Western nations decided to outsource decades ago. So even if a rival country found a massive new mine tomorrow, they would likely still have to send the raw material to China to be processed into a usable form.
And in battery components, the dominance is just as acute.
Even more so. They control 80% of global cobalt refining, 50% of chemical lithium production, and a staggering 70% of natural graphite processing.
And this isn't just domestic refining. They've been strategically securing overseas supplies for years.
Absolutely. Chinese companies own 8 of the 14 largest cobalt mines in the DRC, and they hold a majority stake in the world's largest hard rock lithium reserve. It's total vertical integration, from the mine to the finished battery.
And what's the U.S. dependence on these same inputs?
The contrast could not be starker. The U.S. imports 40% of its lithium, 80% of its cobalt, and 100% of its graphite.
100% of its graphite.
And critically, analysts estimate it could take the U.S. 20 to 30 years, an entire generation, to catch up to the current level of physical control and refinement capacity that's been built overseas.
So even if the U.S. invents the next breakthrough technology, the ability to manufacture it at scale relies on foundational inputs controlled by a rival. It shifts the competition from pure invention to applied physical deployment.
Which leads us to the physical grid for data, not just electrons. This ability to execute at scale extends to core digital infrastructure like 5G.
The 5G gap is maybe the most quantifiable metric of this difference in deployment speed. The numbers are just staggering.
The physical build-out of their digital grid is years ahead. Let's look at the numbers from the end of 2020, which is already a few years ago. They had 150 million 5G users to the US's 6 million.
Okay, but the crucial number is the infrastructure, the base stations.
That's right. They had 700,000 5G base stations. The U.S. had 50,000.
700,000 versus 50,000.
And they had significantly more licensed mid-band spectrum, which is key for speed. The result was average 5G speeds of 300 megabits per second compared to 60 in the U.S.
And that infrastructure disparity means the U.S. risks a fundamental lag in developing the applications that will run on 5G because the physical network just isn't there yet to test and deploy them.
That first mover advantage is everything. It allows them to pioneer and scale next-gen applications. They're already implementing sophisticated smart factories, 5G-enabled remote surgery, driverless robotaxis from companies like Baidu. The physical backbone is there to support it.
So the next generation of globally dominant tech giants might not be American or European simply because they won't have the infrastructure to build on.
It's a very real possibility. And this capacity to scale isn't limited to digital tech. It applies in specialized scientific fields like biotech, too.
Right, like with CAR-T cell therapy for cancer treatment.
Exactly. Instead of just focusing on the basic invention, which often happened elsewhere, they prioritized rapid application and scaling. China quickly became the world's largest sponsor of CAR T-cell therapy clinical trials, hosting over 50% of them globally by 2020.
They're focused on translating scientific discovery into scalable physical technology.
And driving the cost down through process innovation. Take genomics. The giant BGI can now sequence a human genome for a record-breaking $100.
$100.
That is 6 times cheaper than their competitors, and 100,000 times cheaper than it was 20 years ago. This obsession with scaling, process, and cost efficiency is the direct reflection of that long-term technocratic plan.
Okay, so we've established the success of this model driven by technocratic planning and massive physical execution. Now we have to turn to the other side of the coin. The structural problems within the rival system, what some have called the vetocracy, that explain its chronic inability to turn ambition into infrastructure.
This is the heart of the divergence.
Yeah.
The U.S. faces this acute paradox. Despite being one of the wealthiest nations on Earth, it is uniquely ineffective among industrialized countries at delivering critical infrastructure efficiently and cost-effectively.
And you call this paralysis the vetocracy?
It's a political system where too many different actors, groups, agencies, individuals have the effective power to stop or indefinitely delay action, but no single entity has the power to see a project through to completion.
And the result is just astronomical costs and timelines compared to global peers.
They're completely out of line. Building 1 kilometer of heavy rail in the U.S. costs twice as much as it does in Germany, and 3 times as much as in Sweden or Japan.
3 times as much.
The analysis shows only 5 countries in the world have more expensive rail development, and almost all of them are building a much higher proportion of very expensive, deep-tunneled track.
And the timeline failures are just legendary.
Think about the California high-speed rail project. Initially, it was projected to cost $33 billion and be done by 2020.
And the current projection?
$100 billion, and completion by 2033, maybe? Highway projects saw their planning and approval timelines stretch from about 2 years in the 1970s to almost 7 years by 2011.
But the most shocking example has to be the Maryland Intercounty Connector.
A major state highway delayed for 26 years. 26 years waiting for an environmental permit to clear legal challenges. It's not inefficiency, it's total institutional paralysis.
And the scale of execution is the final stark metric. Since 2008, China has built 50,000 kilometers of high-speed rail.
More than the rest of the world combined.
And in that same period, the U.S. built
90 kilometers. This is the difference between a system optimized for physical manifestation and one paralyzed by its own structure.
So let's define the mechanism of this vetocracy more closely. It seems to stem primarily from the environmental review process, specifically the National Environmental Policy Act, NEPA.
NEPA was passed in 1970 with good intentions. It was a grand bargain to introduce robust environmental and social safeguards. But it created a procedural system called adversarial legalism, where everything gets decided through these long, complex legal procedures that are subject to constant court challenges.
So it evolved from a protection into a series of litigation-prone veto points.
That's it. Opposition groups can exploit the vague statutory language in NEPA to challenge agency decisions purely on procedural grounds. They don't have to prove a project is bad for the environment, just that the agency failed to properly assess an alternative or identify a significant impact.
And the courts are open to these challenges.
The law's quasi-constitutional language subjected almost all administrative decisions to a review by federal courts, which fundamentally tilted the system towards those who oppose projects. It gives them immense leverage.
So how have the government agencies reacted to this constant threat of being sued?
They've reacted in a way that's rational, but completely debilitating. They try to litigation-proof their decisions by massively expanding the scope of their environmental impact statements, or EISs.
They're incentivized to study everything to cover themselves.
Right. The average time to prepare an EIS jumped to 5.2 years by 2016. And the documents themselves ballooned to a median of 490 pages.
A 490-page document isn't a planning tool. It's a paper shield against lawsuits.
Exactly. And the data shows this defensive strategy works. In a way, longer EIS correlate with fewer lawsuits. The agencies are making a rational choice within a dysfunctional system.
But it slows everything down to a crawl and diverts immense resources into these tedious defensive processes.
And it ensures that ambitious projects are often scaled down or abandoned just to avoid triggering the threshold for a significant impact, sacrificing utility for conflict avoidance.
And this procedural gridlock is made even worse by what you call the hollowing out of state capacity. The government agencies don't even have the in-house expertise to manage these processes anymore.
That's a huge factor. The ability of the U.S. government to execute complex projects has dramatically declined since the New Deal era. That vacuum has been filled by a vast, profit-driven private consultancy industry.
Which introduces a profit premium on everything.
It does. The most knowledgeable experts have moved to the private sector for higher wages, so the government has to pay a premium to get that expertise back. It also leads to these long, expensive request for proposal processes because the government lacks the in-house knowledge to quickly assess technical plans.
And this shows up in the actual cost of labor, which seems massively inflated compared to other countries.
Dramatically so. Labor costs for U.S. transit projects are typically 40 to 60% of the overall cost. In peer nations like Germany or the UK, it's more like 19 to 30%.
That's a huge difference.
And in high-cost cities like New York, projects often require 4 times the staffing of similar European projects, with no corresponding increase in safety. The entire institutional arrangement encourages firms, unions, and consultants to extract huge premiums from government contracts.
Because the government can't effectively benchmark or manage those costs internally. It's a structural barrier baked into the system.
And that lack of internal expertise also completely degrades the design and procurement systems. It creates an environment where inefficiency is just baked in from the very start.
What's wrong with the procurement structure itself?
Well, contracts are often awarded based on cost alone, which creates perverse incentives. In California, for example, awarding a contract to the lowest initial bid just incentivizes firms to underbid the project to get the contract.
And then make their money back later through change orders and litigation once the project is underway.
Exactly. The government lacks the capacity to effectively challenge those claims because they outsource the initial design and expertise in the first place. The whole system is structured to be adversarial, not cooperative.
And fueling all of this is a fractured institutional environment. There's no single governing body.
So projects devolve into these jurisdictional turf wars. Cities, state, and administrative agencies all have competing budgets and conflicting priorities.
That's how you get those absurd situations like the New York MTA, a state agency having to pay the New York City Parks Department, a city agency for land use, just to build a subway line.
The government is literally negotiating with itself, using taxpayer money, adding immense costs and delay.
So projects become completely reliant on having a powerful political champion to push them through.
Which makes them incredibly vulnerable to shifting political priorities and budget cuts. Success requires steady funding, strong leadership, and robust consensus, a combination that's just increasingly rare in this featocracy.
Okay, the analysis of the dysfunction is compelling, but it's also pretty bleak. The research does suggest some clear, actionable reforms to rebalance state capacity, right? This isn't an unsolvable problem.
No, it's not unsolvable. The reforms have to target the critical bottlenecks: judicial review, institutional fragmentation, and procurement. The goal is to move past the paralysis and create arrangements that balance a muscular, outcome-oriented state with genuine, constructive protections.
So starting with the legal battlefield, how do you temper NEPA without just gutting environmental protections?
The goal is to reduce the scope and duration of the review, not eliminate it. One tool is to implement categorical exclusions for high-priority, low-impact projects, letting them bypass certain reviews.
All right, cut the red tape where it's not needed.
And where a full review is needed, you implement strict, legally enforceable deadlines and page limits on the studies. That directly counters the incentive to study everything.
It forces agencies to be concise and focused on outcomes.
You also have to shorten the statute of limitations for infrastructure challenges. Right now, it can be up to 6 years, which allows for endless legal attrition. And crucially, lawmakers need to clarify the statutory requirements for compliance, reducing the legal ambiguity that opposition groups exploit.
But wouldn't shortening the time to challenge a project just remove the only tool that smaller, marginalized communities have to protect themselves?
That's the essential political tightrope. The focus has to shift from process to substance. The goal isn't to remove protection, but to front-load it. You build in resources for early, substantive community engagement before a final decision is made, making that decision much harder to overturn on a technicality later on.
Okay, next, tackling institutional fragmentation. How do you move from a system of veto points to one of unified authority?
You have to simplify the multi-level network of approvals. The bipartisan infrastructure law took a promising step by assigning single lead agencies with the clear authority to manage permitting. That reduces complexity and interagency conflict.
It brings some structure to the chaos.
And you have to at least explore federal or state preemption of lower jurisdictions for high-priority national projects. It's politically controversial, but it's necessary to stop local challenges from delaying projects for decades.
And we should look at international models, too.
Absolutely. Countries like Australia and the UK use centralized national infrastructure frameworks to guide funding and development, which leads to much greater standardization and cohesiveness.
All right, let's talk procurement, where the incentives are all wrong. How do we fix contracts to promote shared success instead of litigation?
You have to shift the award criteria away from just the lowest cost. Contracts must incorporate factors like past performance, safety records, and binding timelines.
And change the contract structure itself.
We should adopt itemized rather than lump sum contracts. Lump sum contracts force the contractor to price in maximum risk, which inflates the cost. Itemized contracts introduce flexibility for when common sense design changes are needed, lowering the stakes for litigation.
And the public agencies have to be willing to take on more design responsibility themselves.
Yes. When the public sector assumes more design risk, it reduces the risk premiums contractors build into their bids, and it disincentivizes those gold-plated designs that are more about avoiding liability than maximizing utility for the taxpayer.
Finally, none of this works without rebuilding the government's internal expertise. How do you reverse that hollowing out-of-state capacity?
The system has to make public sector work a viable, long-term career path again. That means offering competitive salaries to attract and retain competent managers, engineers, and scientists.
You have to retain that institutional know-how.
When you have that internal expertise, your agencies can properly manage private contractors, navigate the courts, and coordinate between departments. It's also essential for standardizing components and materials, which reduces costs. Ultimately, state capacity is the most important piece of physical infrastructure you can have.
So this deep dive really brings us back to where we started. That macro trader glimpsed a fundamental truth in his logistics maps. The abstract financial numbers were a sedative, masking this radical shift in economic gravity towards controlling the physics of the real world.
Exactly. While one system, driven by long-term planning, builds a resilient physical fortress. You see it in the 10% clean energy GDP, the 40,000 kilometers of UHV lines, the 50,000 kilometers of high-speed rail. The rival system remains paralyzed.
Paralyzed by institutional structures that turn necessary democratic input into indefinite veto points. That's what gives you the crippling costs, the 5.2-year environmental impact statements, the massive labor premiums.
We saw an example of how quickly things can move during the I-95 bridge collapse in Philadelphia in 2023.
Oh, that's a great point.
When emergency powers were invoked, bypassing most of the normal process, a project that would have taken months, if not years, was completed in just 11 days.
That state of exception proves the capacity is there. The raw talent, the materials, it's all there. It's the institutional will and the structural efficiency that are missing.
The challenge is moving beyond this do-no-harm paradigm, which has become a do-nothing paradigm, without returning to the excesses of the past. We need to create institutional arrangements that balance a muscular, outcome-oriented state with genuine, constructive protections.
The ultimate measure of civilizational strength in the 21st century may not be the volatility of a nation's stock market or the size of its consumer debt, but its institutional capacity to physically manifest its collective ambition quickly and cost-effectively in the critical infrastructure necessary to sustain the next wave of technological and economic power.